You are the first person who has ever existed. You wake up in a world that has never seen a human before. There are no parents, no ancestors, no history. There is just you. What do you do? How do you survive? And more importantly, who are you? This may sound like science fiction, but this is exactly what happened to one man. He woke up in a world that had never seen a human before, and he had to build everything from scratch. He didn't know any technology. He didn't have any tools. All he had was his consciousness and the raw earth beneath his feet. But this man survived, and not only survived, he thrived. He built a civilization, raised a family, and ultimately changed the course of history. His name was Uganobi, and he is the first man who has ever existed. Now, obviously, that's not true. We all have parents and ancestors, and there is a whole world of history that we can tap into. But what Uganobi's story does teach us is that we are capable of building something new, something different, something better. We don't need to rely on the past. We can create our own future. Imagine waking up one day to find yourself in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by sights, sounds, and sensations that are completely new to you. You have no idea how you got there, no memory of who you are or where you come from. And to make matters worse, you're utterly alone. No one is around to help you, to guide you, or even to acknowledge your existence. This is the terrifying scenario that the first human being ever faced the moment he became self-aware. Picture this. There's a moment when awareness floods in like water breaking through a dam. Not birth, because there was no mother, no gentle hands to guide the way, but the raw, electric moment when consciousness just began. Where did it start? How does one go from nothing to everything? The answer lies in the human experience itself. From the first moment we are born, we are bombarded with sensory information. Our eyes take in the kaleidoscope of colors, shapes, and movements. Our ears strain to make sense of the cacophony of sounds. Our noses detect a myriad of aromas. Our tongues register a burst of flavors. Our skin responds to a myriad of textures. Yet none of this is particularly remarkable. Most animals experience their world through senses not too different from our own. But then something extraordinary happens. As we grow, we don't merely react to these sensations, we begin to interpret them. We organize them into a coherent picture of the world. The word dog doesn't initially describe a four-legged furry creature that barks. It's a sound we learn to associate with a particular animal. The concept of wet doesn't exist until we learn to categorize water as such. And the feeling of pain doesn't have a name or a form until we collectively decide to label it. In essence, we impose order on chaos. We turn raw data into meaningful information, and in doing so, we become human. The first human being didn't gradually wake up from sleep. He exploded into existence with a mind that had never known anything before. Every sight, sound, smell, and texture hitting him simultaneously without any framework to understand what any of it meant. The warmth of sunlight on skin, but no word for warm. No concept of sun. The sound of wind through leaves, but no understanding of wind. No knowledge of leaves. Just pure, unfiltered sensation crashing over a mind that had no reference point for any of it. This wasn't like a baby's first moments, where instinct and genetic programming provide some guidance. This was a fully formed human consciousness experiencing everything for the very first time. The rustle of grass beneath him would have been as alien and potentially threatening as the distant roar of a waterfall. Everything was new. Everything was unknown. Everything was potentially dangerous. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite having no learned behaviors, no cultural knowledge, no language to organize his thoughts, this first human would have possessed something extraordinary, the spark of human intelligence. It's that unique combination of curiosity, pattern recognition, and adaptability that separates us from every other species on Earth. His mind, though overwhelmed, would have started to piece together the puzzle of existence. He would have noticed patterns in the sky, the predictable rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon. He would have observed the behavior of animals, their movement patterns, their interactions. He would have started to categorize, to sort the overwhelming jumble of experiences into meaningful groups. Over time, he would have developed the ability to communicate, to express his observations and discoveries through gestures, sounds, and eventually, words. This is the essence of the human experience. The process of turning the unknown into the familiar, of transforming chaos into order. Yet amidst this journey of discovery, there would have been moments of pure terror. Imagine being utterly alone in a world that makes no sense, surrounded by dangers you don't understand. The first human would have experienced the full force of existential fear, the primal terror that comes from feeling utterly helpless. But even in that fear, there would have been something else, a flicker of curiosity, a spark of wonder. The same fear that paralyzed him would have also propelled him forward, driving him to explore, to understand, to make sense of this strange new existence. And that, in essence, is the story of humanity. A story that began with a single individual, the first human being, who woke up one day to find himself in a world that was both terrifying and exhilarating. His journey from that moment of awakening to the development of human society is a testament to the resilience, adaptability, and sheer determination of the human spirit. What if you were the only human on Earth? You wake up in the morning, sunlight streaming through the window. You get out of bed and walk to the window to close the blinds. As you do, you notice a bird outside and think, "That's a nice bird." You watch it fly away and then you wonder, do birds fly at night? You shrug and decide to find out. So you grab some bread and go outside. You walk around the block, past houses with front porches and swings in the yard, past parks with empty jungle gyms and baseball diamonds. You walk until you reach a grocery store and open the door. Inside, you push your cart down the aisles, marveling at the bounty of food available to you. You select a can of soup and some bread and head to the checkout. You scan the items and realize there's no need for money. There's no one to take it from. You stuff the food in your pockets and leave. You come across a library and step inside. You browse the shelves, pulling out books and examining them, not knowing how to read, and then you see a movie. On TV, they have picture books now, right? So you sit down and watch a cartoon. It's funny, you think, but you're not sure why. After the cartoon ends, you feel a sudden urge to dance. So you start moving to the beat of a song playing in your head. You move from room to room, dancing and singing until you tire yourself out. Then you lie down on a nearby bed and fall asleep. When you wake up, you feel a pang of loneliness. You want to talk to someone, anyone, but there's no one around. You hear a noise outside and run to the window. It's a dog barking. You wish you had a dog. A loyal companion who would greet you at the door, wagging his tail, wanting nothing more than to please you. But you know there aren't any dogs, or cats, or birds, or people. You are utterly alone. But let's pause here and really consider what absolute solitude means. We throw around the word alone so casually, but none of us have ever truly experienced it. Even in our loneliest moments, we carry with us the voices of every person who has ever spoken to us, the memories of every human interaction, the learned behaviors passed down through generations. We are never truly alone because we are connected to the entire human experience. The first human had none of that. No mother's lullaby echoing in his memory. No father's voice teaching him about the world. No siblings to play with or learn from. No community to belong to. He was the only human consciousness in a world that had never known humanity. The weight of that isolation would have been crushing in ways we can barely comprehend. Think about how we define ourselves today. We are someone's child, someone's friend, someone's student or teacher. We belong to communities, cultures, nations. We speak languages that connect us to millions of others. We share jokes, stories, traditions. All of our human identity is built on our connections to other humans. Strip all of that away, and what remains? The first human would have had to construct his identity from scratch, with no mirrors, literal or metaphorical, to show him who he was. He would have had to discover his own humanity without any examples to follow. In many ways, he would have been like a scientist studying a species of one, trying to understand what it meant to be human by observing his own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Yet perhaps this ultimate isolation would have revealed something profound about human nature. Without the influence of others, without social expectations or cultural norms, what would emerge? Would kindness exist without anyone to be kind to? Would curiosity flourish without anyone to share discoveries with? Would creativity bloom without an audience to appreciate it? Our humanity may have been born in solitude, but it is through our connections to others that we truly thrive. Fear, certainly. That most basic of survival emotions. But what about joy? Could someone who had never known happiness truly experience it? Or would joy be something he would have to discover, perhaps in the simple pleasure of fresh water on a parched throat or the warmth of sunlight after a cold night? Love presents an even more complex question. Romantic love, parental love, friendship. All of these require others. But what about self-love? Could the first human learn to care for himself without anyone to model what care looks like? Or would he have to discover compassion by showing it to himself, creating the very template for human kindness? Anger would have been there, certainly. The frustration of not understanding, of being hungry and not knowing how to find food, of being cold and not knowing how to make fire. But anger at whom? At what? Without others to blame or gods to rage against, his anger would have been pure and immediate. Anger at the situation, at the difficulty of existence itself. But if there's one emotion that truly sets us apart from other animals, if there is one emotion that has the power to elevate us to the heights of greatness or drag us down to the depths of despair, it is the one we call wonder. Imagine for a moment the world as this one human might have seen it. Every sunset would have been the first sunset ever witnessed by human eyes. Every flower, every animal, every natural phenomenon would have been a first discovery. In our world, saturated with information and imagery, we struggle to recapture that sense of wonder. The first human would have lived in a perpetual state of it. His emotions would have been raw, unfiltered, and honest in ways that ours can never be. He would have laughed when something delighted him, cried when something hurt him, felt fear when threatened, all without the complex layers of social expectation that color our emotional experiences today. His emotions would have been his compass, guiding him through the uncharted territories of an unknown world. They would have been his connection to this world, making him feel its beauty, its pain, its mystery. To understand the emotions of the first human is to understand the wellspring from which our own humanity flows. It is to see our emotional nature stripped bare, unadorned by the complexities of civilization. It is to recognize the power and the fragility of the human spirit in the face of a vast and indifferent universe. If you were to ask any one of us, man or woman, what it's like to be human, we might hesitate. We might fumble for words. We might try to explain the sum of our parts, our hopes and dreams, our fears and failures, our loves and losses. But none of those things are unique to us. Every living creature experiences some variation of those things. So what remains? What makes us uniquely human? What is that one thing that we can say with certainty? It is our capacity for emotion, our ability to feel deeply and intensely, to be moved by the world around us, to be awestruck by the beauty of a sunrise, to be terrified by the power of a storm, to be overwhelmed by the immensity of the universe and our place within it. Our emotions are what make us human. They are what set us apart from the cold, unfeeling world of machines and algorithms. They are what allow us to connect with each other on a deep and meaningful level. They are what make life worth living. When we look back at the history of our species, we see a story written in emotions. the paintings of our earliest ancestors, the stories they told around the campfire, the rituals they performed, all of it was motivated by emotion. Our emotions are what have driven us to create, to explore, to dream. They are what have allowed us to survive and thrive in the face of unimaginable challenges. Our emotions are a source of strength, of resilience, of creativity. They are what make us uniquely human. And yet sometimes our emotions can be our undoing. Sometimes they can lead us to do terrible things, to hurt ourselves and others, to destroy the very things we love. When we are consumed by anger or hatred or fear, we lose our humanity. We become less than we are capable of being. So how do we harness the power of our emotions, use them to our advantage while protecting ourselves from their destructive potential? How do we balance the need for authenticity with the need for control, the desire for connection with the need for independence? These are the questions that we must ask ourselves if we are to understand what it means to be human. We are emotional creatures living in a world that often doesn't understand or care about our emotions. We are told to suppress our feelings, to push through the pain, to ignore the hurt. But when we do, we risk losing ourselves. When we lose ourselves, we lose our humanity. For what is humanity if not the ability to feel, to be moved, to care? What is humanity if not the sum of our emotions? The first human didn't go to school. In fact, he didn't have the benefit of any teachers at all. All the knowledge he would have acquired would have been entirely self-taught, which raises an incredible. What were his very first lessons? First, hunger. It's probably the first teacher the first human would have encountered. Not the gentle rumble of a stomach that reminds us it's time for lunch, but the gnawing, desperate emptiness that signals genuine starvation. Without any knowledge of what food was, where to find it, or how to prepare it, staying alive would have been his most immediate and challenging lesson. Picture him stumbling through a world full of potential meals and potential poisons, with no way to distinguish between them. That red berry, is it nourishment or death? That stream water, is it safe to drink or filled with invisible dangers? Every choice would have been a gamble with his life. But here's where human intelligence would have begun to shine through the darkness of ignorance. Trial and error became his university. Watch what animals eat, then try it himself. Notice that some water sources make him sick, while others don't. Learn that certain plants ease hunger, while others cause pain. Each mistake was a potentially fatal lesson, but each success built his knowledge base. This wasn't just learning, this was the birth of human wisdom. The remarkable thing is that he would have had to develop not just knowledge, but methodology. How do you test whether something is safe to eat when you're the only test subject? How do you remember what you've learned when you have no language to encode the information? The first human would have had to invent the very concept of careful observation, of systematic thinking, of logical deduction. His body would have been his first and most important tool. Those opposable thumbs that we take for granted would have been revolutionary instruments of survival. The ability to grip, manipulate, and use objects would have been set apart from every other creature sharing his world. But without anyone to teach him, he would have had to discover these capabilities through experimentation and necessity. Sleep would have been another terrifying challenge. In our world, sleep is rest and recovery. For the first human, it would have been a nightly gamble with death. Closing his eyes meant becoming vulnerable to predators, to the elements, to unknown dangers. Yet the need for sleep would have been overwhelming. Finding safe places to rest, learning to sleep lightly, developing an intuitive sense of danger, these would have been essential survival skills developed through sheer necessity. Now, let's talk about one of the most important aspects of his self-education, tool use. Imagine our proto-human friend coming across a sharp rock. He might have initially used it like a knife, but soon realized that carrying it around was cumbersome. Enter the idea of a spear. Initially, this might have been nothing more than a sharpened stick, but it represented a significant leap in his understanding of his environment. The spear allowed him to hunt, to defend himself, and to influence his surroundings in new ways. But this required abstract thought. He had to understand that a pointy stick was more useful if it were longer and thinner. He needed to know that hitting one end of a rock made it move. This wasn't just about problem solving. It was about understanding cause and effect, about conceiving of an object in his mind before it existed in reality. He started to plan ahead, anticipating what he needed to survive and how to get it. And this process drove the evolution of his brain as much as it did the evolution of his hands. As time went on, he began to notice patterns in the world around him, the cycles of day and night, the changing seasons, the habits of animals. His understanding of the world grew, and with it, his ability to predict and control his environment. He could now navigate his world more effectively, finding food more reliably, predicting weather patterns, sheltering appropriately. Through this long, arduous process of trial and error, of observing and deducing, of experimenting and adapting, the first human went from a helpless infant to a self-sufficient survivor. He was a teacherless student who became the first master of his own learning. And in doing so, he laid the foundation for everything that came after. His journey was the genesis of human ingenuity. His struggles were the crucible in which the steel of our intellect was forged. We stand on the shoulders of this ancient ancestor, benefiting from the knowledge and wisdom he painstakingly acquired. In a world that often feels too complicated, too overwhelming, it's important to remember that we began as a single individual, unaided, unteached, utterly alone. And that's why the first human is the greatest teacher of them all. When most people think about the history of humanity, the image that comes to mind is usually something like this. You know, a bunch of hairless apes huddled around a campfire, eating some sad, watery gruel. But did you know that the discovery of fire was one of the most important turning points in the history of the human race? Yeah, for the first human who stumbled upon it, fire must have seemed like actual magic. And you'd be right on the money if you guessed that the first humans learned about fire from nature itself. Because back before the days of Rosie the Riveter, there were no lighters, no matches, no fire drills. So our earliest ancestors had to learn how to capture lightning. That's right. They literally had to wrestle burning bolts out of the sky. Well, not really wrestle, more like watch in awe and terror as trees burst into flames. Eventually, they might have noticed that those fallen flaming trees made for very cozy campfires. But capturing lightning is impossible. If our ancestors had tried to build a fire that way, they'd have spent their entire lives chasing storms. Instead, they would have needed to learn how to make fire from other sources, like rocks, for instance. But even making fire with rocks isn't as easy as it sounds. First, you need to find two rocks that are very different from each other. Then you need to hit them together just so, and you need to have a lot of patience and stamina because this is going to take a while. In fact, it could take hours of striking the rocks together before anything actually happened. But eventually, one lucky, rock-wielding human noticed that all that striking produced a fine, powdery residue when it hit the ground. This residue, along with some smaller bits of rock, looked kind of like dust. So our aspiring pyromancer gathered some leaves and twigs and made a pile. Then, holding his breath, he set the pile on fire with his burning rock. Voila! Success. Of course, this is a vast simplification of what must have been an incredibly long and frustrating process of trial and error. But that doesn't begin to cover it. Making fire with rocks is not as easy as it sounds. Our ancestors might have started to notice that certain types of wood were easier to ignite than others. Maybe they noticed that when they rubbed two pieces of wood together really fast, a small pile of dust appeared near the base of where the two woods were meeting. At first, these would have been just happy accidents, random occurrences that our ancestors couldn't explain and didn't happen very often. But slowly, through trial and error and lots of patience, early humans began to understand that certain things could be set on fire, and that they could create fire themselves. But the exact way they did this is unknown. We don't even know if they used the bow drill method, which is the oldest known way of creating an ember that's still used today. So let's take a minute to appreciate the sheer difficulty of this task. Early humans had no lighter fluid, no ferrocerium, no fire piston, no fire saw. All they had was whatever natural materials they could gather and whatever skills they could develop. Imagine sitting in a dark cave, shivering and hungry, trying to start a fire by rubbing two sticks together. You try and try, but nothing happens. You spend hours on this, and by the end you have nothing to show for it but blisters on your hands and aching arms. Then, just as you're about to give up, a single wisp of smoke appears. A tiny ember forms. In that moment, you understand. It clicks. You've figured it out. With trembling hands, you blow on the ember, coaxing it into a flame. When the first logs catch fire, you feel like you've accomplished something truly special, something that sets you apart from the animals around you. In a way, fire represented the first real victory of human ingenuity over the natural world. It gave our ancestors their first sense of control over their environment, and that feeling must have been like magic. Fire changed everything for early humans. It allowed them to cook their food, which made it safer to eat and gave them access to new nutrients. Fire kept the cold away and the darkness at bay. And, in a very real way, it gave our ancestors their first sense of power over the world around them. When you think about it, a shelter isn't just a structure made of wood and stone, or concrete and steel. At its most basic, a shelter is an idea, a concept that has been universal to our species since the very beginning. Shelter represents more than just protection from the elements. It represents the human need to create a space that is truly ours, a place where we can feel safe and secure, a place where we can be ourselves. So let's go back to the very beginning. Let us imagine what it would have been like for the first human who had the idea to build the very first shelter. Our story begins with the first human, a man who lived in a time when the world was just a wild, untamed wilderness. For him, the sun was a life-giving force, but it was also a scorching god that could bring withering heat. The rain was a refreshing blessing, but it could also be a raging torrent that washed away everything in its path. The wind was a playful spirit that rustled through the trees, but it could also become a howling beast that tore down the strongest of shelters. He was constantly at the mercy of the elements, forced to move from place to place in search of food and safety. One day, he came across a cave that was just big enough to fit him and his family. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them some protection from the elements and some peace of mind. They could finally stay put and feel safe from the dangers of the wild. But after a while, he started to feel uneasy. The cave was dark and dank. It smelled like dirt and decay. And whenever he heard a strange noise or felt a sudden draft, he jumped at the slightest sound. It was then that he had a thought that would change everything. Why not build a shelter that was truly his own? A place where he could feel safe and comfortable. A place where he could be himself. The first Leon-2 was an act of pure creativity, born from necessity, but shaped by imagination. He looked around at the natural world and saw endless possibilities. He noticed that branches could be woven together, like the twigs of a bird's nest, to form a sturdy framework. He observed that stones could be stacked one on top of the other, like the layers of a hill, to create a strong and lasting structure. He even experimented with leaves and vines to create a roof that would keep out the rain. But how do you develop these ideas when you've never seen construction before? How do you know which branches are strong enough to bear the weight of a roof? Or which stones will hold up against the pressure of the elements? Every principle of architecture, every technique of building would have had to be discovered through trial. An error tested and retested until the first human was sure that his shelter would stand firm. The physical act of building would have been grueling. Without tools, every task would have been accomplished with hands, teeth, and ingenuity. Dragging heavy stones, bending stubborn branches, finding ways to secure materials without rope or nails. His hands would have been cut, his muscles strained, his patience tested. But with each small improvement, with each successful modification, he would have been building more than just shelter. He would have been building confidence. As the first human looked upon his creation, he saw more than just a pile of rocks and sticks. He saw a testament to his own strength and ingenuity. He realized that he was no longer at the mercy of the elements, but that he could actually shape his environment to suit his needs. He could adapt his shelter as the seasons changed, adding windbreaks for storms, creating drainage for rain, building separate areas for cooking and sleeping. Each modification would have been a lesson in planning, in thinking ahead, in understanding the relationship between cause and effect. This was just the beginning. Over the years, the first human would continue to experiment with different types of shelters, learning from both his successes and his failures. He would discover new materials and techniques, passing his knowledge down to the next generation. And so the tradition of building would continue, evolving and improving until it led to the development of modern architecture. If you're like me, you probably take time for granted. We tell stories with timelines, count memories by the year, and organize our days by the minute. But have you ever stopped to think how strange this all is? We talk about being born at a certain time, but what does that even mean? To answer that question, let's go back to the beginning and imagine what the first human's experience of time would have been like. He would have experienced the world as an endless cycle of day and night, season and sun, rain and calm. These natural rhythms would have been his first understanding of time. Days would begin when the darkness lifted and end when it returned. The sun would rise and set again and again, marking the steady pulse of time. In this world, there were no clocks to tell the time, no phone to check for the date. Each day was simply another day. Each night, simply another night. This first human would have to develop his understanding of time from scratch, relying only on his memory and observation. The first human would have marked the passing of days by the position of the sun, the changing colors of the leaves, the phases of the moon. As the seasons turned, he learned that time moved in larger patterns too. There were longer cycles of heat and cold, wet and dry, life and death. Each year was a little different, but each followed a similar pattern, a story told as old as time itself. He became his own calendar, marking the turning of the seasons by the changing of the birds, the blooming of the flowers, the ripening of the fruit. Time was not just something that passed, it was something he experienced, something he lived through each day, each night, each season. But time wasn't the only thing he had to understand. He also had to figure out who he was, what his place was in this vast and complicated world. He had no parents to tell him his name, no culture to tell him who he was supposed to be, no siblings to tell him how he compared. In fact, he had no one telling him anything about himself. He didn't know if he was loved, wanted, accepted, needed. No one looked like him, sounded like him, thought like him. In short, he didn't know anyone. This would have been both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, he could be anyone he chose to be. On the other hand, he had no guidelines for who he should be. No one was going to tell him who he was. Then he would have to figure it out on his own. And that meant confronting some fundamental questions. What kind of person did he want to be? What did he value? What was important to him? How did he want to spend his time? What kind of mark did he want to leave on the world? Without the opinions, expectations, or judgments of others, he would have had to develop his own sense of right and wrong, good and bad, success and failure. His compass would have been his own intuition, his own heart. Memory would have been crucial to his developing sense of identity. The accumulation of experiences, the patterns of his own behavior, the consistency of his thoughts and reactions. All of these would have formed the foundation of his self-concept. He would have been the author of his own identity, writing his character through his actions and choices. But there was no one to read his story, no one to share in his triumphs or learn from his mistakes. He was both the writer and the audience of his own life, which is perhaps the most terrifying and exhilarating thing imaginable. In the grand tapestry of human existence, he was a solitary thread, weaving his own pattern into the fabric of time. He was the first, but he wouldn't be the last. One day he would teach his ways to others, and they would build on his foundation, adding their own experiences and insights. Together, they would create a rich and complex culture, full of stories, traditions, and values. But that day was not today. Today, he was alone, and that meant he was free. Free to explore, free to discover, free to create, free to be whoever he wanted to be. His time, his story, his life. If you've ever found yourself staring into the abyss of an existential crisis, you might have wondered, am I though? Turns out you're not. You see, we humans have been contemplating the big questions since the very first one of us found ourselves alone in this vast universe. In a way, the first human being was the world's first philosopher. Let's imagine what that first human's life might have been like. Alone, far from the comforts of society, family, or even a well-stocked grocery store. Our proto-philosopher would have been surrounded by the raw materials of existence, the fundamental elements of nature. Every quiet moment, and there would have been many when you're alone in the wild, would have been an opportunity for deep reflection, for pondering the mysteries of the universe. Without books or teachers, no philosophical traditions to guide him. He would have been on his own to grapple with the big questions. Where did he come from? What was the point of it all? What happens after we die? Without a creator to explain his existence or a society to give him roles to fill, he would have had to create his own sense of purpose. Perhaps survival itself would have been enough at first. Finding food, shelter, clothing, but as these basic needs became more manageable, deeper questions would have bubbled to the surface. Take the question of purpose. For instance, why was he here? What was he supposed to do? Without religious or societal norms to dictate his actions, he would have been free to decide what to believe and how to live. He might have looked to the animals around him for guidance, observing their behaviors, their habits, their interactions. Did they too ponder their existence? Did they worry about death? Or were they simply driven by instinct? He might have noticed that while the animals seemed to live in the moment, always seeking their next meal, always alert to danger, they didn't seem burdened by the weight of their own existence. Their lives were simpler, driven by immediate needs and desires. And then there's death itself. It would have been a constant presence in his thoughts, not just the fear of dying, but the philosophical puzzle of what death meant. He would have watched the animals around him die, the plants that withered with the seasons, the natural cycles of decay and renewal. He would have seen the effects of the sun and the moon, the waxing and waning of power in the sky. And he would have wondered, what does this all mean for me? How should I live knowing that one day I will die? Without concepts of afterlife or soul, he would have had to develop his own understanding of mortality. He wouldn't have had the luxury of burying his head in the sand like an ostrich, pretending that death didn't exist. He would have had to confront it, understand it, make sense of it in the context of his own life. This struggle to understand death might have been one of his earliest philosophical endeavors, one of the first great mysteries he attempted to solve. But death wasn't the only puzzle. The beauty of the natural world would have posed its own philosophical challenges. Why did sunsets move him so deeply? Why did he feel drawn to certain landscapes, certain sounds? Why did music, even if just the sound of wind through trees, seem to speak to something deep within him? These aesthetic experiences would have been profoundly meaningful, but utterly mysterious. And then there's the mind itself. Our philosopher king would have been aware of his own awareness, capable of thinking about his own thoughts, about the past, about the future, about the very nature of his existence. This recursive nature of consciousness would have been both fascinating and bewildering. How do you understand the mind? He might have wondered, using the mind itself. How do you examine the tool with the tool? What is this thing that I am that allows me to think, to feel, to dream? Without religious or scientific frameworks to explain consciousness, he would have been left to his own devices to understand his own mind. He would have developed his own theories about how the world worked. Why does the sun rise and set? What causes storms? Where do animals come from? His explanations might have been wildly inaccurate by our standards, but they would have been genuine attempts to understand reality using pure human reason. No sacred texts, no teachers, no traditions, just him and his thoughts and the endless expanse of the natural world. We don't know if this first human survived long enough to have children, to have passed on his philosophical musings, to have laid the foundation for civilization. But if he did, if he sparked the first ember of human consciousness, we can be sure of one thing. It was lonely at the top. This original thinker would have been utterly alone in his quest for knowledge, his understanding of the world. And his place in it would have been colored by his own experiences, his own fears, and his own dreams. This first philosopher would have wrestled with the big questions, pondered the mysteries of existence, and in doing so, set in motion a chain of thought that has lasted millennia. Who was the first human? This question has a straightforward scientific answer. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago. But it doesn't really answer the deeper question of what it means to be human. What did the first human do? How did he think? How did he feel? The answers to these questions can be found in the deepest recesses of our own minds. Strip away everything that makes us distinctly us, our culture, language, society, even our education. What remains is a startlingly simple answer. The first human was a human being. He was curious about the world around him. He wondered why the sky was blue and the leaves were green. He questioned where the sun went when it disappeared below the horizon. These simple acts of wondering and exploring were the wellsprings of his humanity. He was also an inventor, constantly seeking to improve his situation. He built better shelters, more efficient tools, and weapons. He devised ways to capture and store food, to cook it more effectively. He created the first crude musical instruments and works of art. In doing so, he discovered the wellspring of his creativity, the spark of genius that has allowed our species to create symphonies and satellites, novels and nuclear energy. But perhaps most important of all, the first human was a learner. When faced with a new situation, he didn't panic. He didn't despair. He didn't give up. Instead, he figured out how to make it work. He learned to adapt, to improvise, to solve problems with whatever resources were at hand. This is the essence of human intelligence, not just the accumulation of facts and figures, but the capacity to learn, to grow, to change in response to experience. It is this intelligence that has allowed us to master the most complex technologies, to create works of art that move us to tears or laughter, to explore the furthest reaches of space and time. The first human would have lived a life of constant wonder. He would have gazed up at the stars and pondered our place in the vastness of the universe. He would have looked down at an insect and marveled at its intricate design. He would have felt the wind on his skin and smelled the flowers in the fields and tasted the sweetness of ripe fruit and heard the song of birds and seen the beauty of a sunset and touched the softness of a child's cheek and laughed with friends around a fire. All of these experiences would have been new to him, amazing, wonderful, full of delight. He would have experienced the full range of human emotion, joy and sorrow, fear and wonder, frustration and satisfaction. He would have felt the pain of loss and the ecstasy of love, the loneliness of isolation and the comfort of companionship. In short, he would have been fully alive. His emotional life would have been rich and complex, not because he was taught to feel this way, but because these emotions are intrinsic to the human condition. They are as much a part of what makes us human as our capacity for language or our ability to walk upright. The first human's relationship with nature would have been profound. He would have been intimately connected to the natural rhythms of the world around him. The seasons, the weather, the growth and decay of plants, the migration of animals, the cycles of day and night. All of these would have shaped his experience of the world. He would have been acutely aware of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. But he would also have been filled with a sense of awe and wonder at the beauty and diversity of the natural world. He would have seen the intricate patterns in a leaf or the delicate balance of an ecosystem and marveled at the complexity and interconnectedness of all living things. In a very real sense, the first human would have been the most connected human who ever lived. He would have been connected to everything, to the earth beneath his feet, the air he breathed, the water he drank, the animals he hunted, the plants he gathered, the stars in the sky above him. He would have felt himself to be a part of something larger than himself, a member of a great chain of being that linked all living things together. In the end, the first human would have been a survivor. He would have lived through times of plenty and times of want. He would have endured the challenges of a changing climate, the threats of predators, the loneliness of isolation, the pain of loss. But he would have persevered, not because he was strong or clever or lucky, but because he was human. He had the capacity for curiosity, for learning, for adapting, for creating, for feeling, for hoping. And it was these qualities that enabled him to survive and ultimately to thrive. So who was the first human? He was one of us, a creature of flesh and blood and bone, a thinker and a dreamer, a lover and a friend, a hunter and a gatherer, a maker of tools and a teller of stories. He was the first human, and he was one of us. Who was the first human? This seemingly simple question takes us to the very origins of our species, forcing us to confront the mystery of our existence. Before there was society, language, or even the concept of humanity, there was just him, the first human. A single individual thrust into existence utterly alone. Now let's imagine we're having a conversation with that first human. If we were suddenly transported back to the dawn of humanity, what would such a conversation be like? What could we possibly say to each other? And what might he tell us about his extraordinary existence? Imagine sitting around a campfire with him, the first human, as the flames crackle and dance before you. The night is filled with unfamiliar sounds, the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the distant roar of a wild animal. There's a vast expanse of wilderness all around you, untouched, untamed, alive. You're alone with the first human, separated not just by time, but by an entire universe of experience. The first human story is the story of humanity's awakening, the moment when consciousness first emerged. When curiosity flickered into existence and the desire to understand, to explore, to create, took root in the human psyche. His story is the origin story of our species. It's a narrative that has been pondered by philosophers and scientists alike, though it remains shrouded in mystery. For the first human, life would have been a series of firsts, each one shaping and defining the human experience. The first sunrise, the first realization of self, the first encounter with the vastness of nature, the first act of creation, the first taste of food, the first experience of fear, the first moment of joy. Everything for him would have been new, unknown, and utterly captivating. The first human story is also one of resilience. He existed in a world without guarantees, without the safety nets of society, without the knowledge and tools that have made modern life more comfortable. He faced the elements directly, relying on his wits and his adaptability to survive. His story is a testament to the tenacity of the human spirit, our capacity to endure and overcome in the face of immense challenges. But amidst the struggle for survival, the first human would have found moments of wonder, of joy, of connection with the world around him. He would have experienced the satisfaction of creating tools, the comfort of shelter, the pleasure of companionship, the thrill of discovery. His story isn't just about hardship and struggle. It's also about the triumph of the human spirit, our ability to find beauty and meaning even in the harshest environments. Now imagine the questions he might ask you, a time traveler from the future. He might want to know about the world you left behind, about the course humanity took after he died, about the advancements, the innovations, the creations that came after him. He might ask about the state of humanity, about its triumphs and its struggles, about the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. It's a daunting task to encapsulate the essence of an entire species, of thousands of years of history, of countless lives lived and lessons learned. What would the first human's reaction be to learning about the world he helped create? Would he be proud, saddened, disappointed, or hopeful? What would he have thought about the choices humanity made, the path it took, the challenges it faced? The story of the first human is a powerful metaphor for the journey of each individual human. Just as he explored the world, so do we, each in our own way, each with our own unique experiences and perspectives. He teaches us that life is a journey of discovery, of growth, of learning, and that every moment is an opportunity to create meaning, to leave our mark on the world, however small. He faced the sunrise each day with no guarantee of survival, no certainty about the future, no one to depend on but himself. Yet he would have continued to strive, to learn, to grow, to create meaning from his existence. The first human is a reminder that the greatest adventures are often solitary ones. He shows us that true strength lies not in numbers, but in the resilience of the individual. And he teaches us that the greatest journeys are those that begin with a single step. As you ponder the story of the first human, think about the legacy you want to leave behind, the impact you want to make on the world. Remember that you, too, are part of an unbroken chain of consciousness stretching back to the dawn of humanity. And as you look to the future, let the example of the first human inspire you to be curious, to be resilient, to be creative, and to always keep moving forward.